I'd like to introduce Jonathan Essex and Peter Sims. They've been leading on some work that Greenhouse has been doing for a few years now on thinking about how many jobs we can create if we were serious about a transition to a zero carbon economy. This is really like countering the arguments that the jobs versus environment argument. I mean, typically for example, early in July, Len McCluskey wrote to all Labour MPs urging them to vote for the Heathrow expansion because he said it would result in lots of unionised jobs. And I think that's a real, you have to realise that the transition is going to result in jobs being lost, but it will also result in jobs being created. And we think there'll be a net increase of jobs, and that you also need to think not just about the overall jobs, but where they are. So we started off a couple of years ago looking at the Isle of Wight, a nice little self-contained area. So this is the report on that project, a green transition for the Isle of Wight. And then last year we looked at a very different area, Sheffield City region, so big urban area, much more unemployment, that sort of thing, post-industrial situation. Both those projects, that work was part of the Green European Foundation project on ecological methods of production, EcoPro. Yeah. Is that what it's called? I can't remember what
EcoPro is definitely the acronym.
Yeah, EcoPro is the acronym. And this year we're leading our own transnational project within the Green European Foundation, and working with the foundation in Ireland. I think Tommy was here from Ireland. Where was it? Yeah. So they did an event in Ireland in June, so if you go and talk to Tommy about the situation in Ireland if you're interested. And we're also working with some people in Hungary, and then we're taking the results of all this to the COP in Poland in December. So, but what we've been doing for the UK this year is looking at the whole of the UK and thinking about looking by local authority area how many jobs have been created. And just to say, I should have said, these reports are available on our store out there, which has got all of the lots of greenhouse reports, probably not all of them, but you can buy them there. They're also free to download from our website. Okay, so I'll hand over to Jonathan. Jonathan's used to work for Bioregional, or does work for Bioregional.
Used to.
Used to. Go on. Say a bit more about yourself.
Thank you. I'm a Green Councillor down in Surrey, and I work in international development. And I'm here with Peter Sims, who is electronics engineer, and we've worked together on a project which is looking at how many and how much. I think lots of people have described what the transition to a more sustainable society might look like, but we want to quantify the challenge. That's the challenge that two engineers places the audience to today. So I was going to start off presenting a little bit of the context and how that relates to the first session which we had about the, if you like, the scale of the climate challenge and what may already be confronting us, and then hand over to Peter to talk through the modelling work that we've done so far, and then I was going to wrap up with some final thoughts. So just to kick off, firstly, you know, there's a real challenge with climate change, and we know it is a serious challenge, and the science just seems to be catching up with the reality of what's already happening and telling us. So rather than the sort of millimetres and centimetres of sea level rise we're being talked about, if all the ice melts that's on the Antarctic, that's in the glaciers, then we're talking about 66 metres of sea level rise from ice melt alone. I spent a year working in Bangladesh. In 2004-05, there was tens of centimetres of historic sea level rise, combined with a 1 in 10-year monsoon which covered large amounts of the country with water. I can't imagine what the future climate change would look like for a place like that, let alone here. So I sometimes feel myself in my mind thinking, well, you know, am I getting very angry do I then wrestle with myself saying, well, if I just change a light bulb and I can keep flying, or I change my car and I can keep eating meat, bargain with yourself about, what sort of scale of change are we looking about here? And then when you realise how big it is, and it's not just about our houses and turning some engines off at traffic lights, we need to change the whole of our society, and then you compare it to where we are and where we're going, I can feel really depressed. And then when you get to that point, maybe you accept that that's where we're at. And that's the point where we can start to get together and we can act together. Because I really believe that it's through action together that we can overcome the fear and despair which sometimes lurks in the battle of our consciousness. So we need not a politics for 99%, we need a politics for the 100%. Tim Jackson, in his recent analysis on stagnation of the UK economy, perhaps because we're reaching the limits of the amounts of resources we can exploit, he says, if we push for growth, we're just going to make the economy more and more unequal. Actually, dealing with climate change and mitigating climate change effects is about making sure we move forward, not in a world of robotisation, automation, globalisation, urbanisation, but moving forward in a way where we reconnect to each other and able to care for each other again because we treat each other as equals. That's because we don't rely on a few people to somehow solve the problem for us, but we recognise that to solve this problem, it's about more than sitting in a basement on a Saturday morning. It's about what we do with our day jobs. It's about creating more people in work, having the prime purpose of their life in doing things differently and creating that transition. That will make things fairer for everyone. So if we all engage, the rich will benefit, the poor will benefit, we will all benefit. And the story we're telling you today is not a new story. Around 10 years ago, a pamphlet was created by the trade union group of the Campaign Against Climate Change here in the UK. And they estimated, it felt like on the back of an envelope, but it's a fairly thick pamphlet for those of you who want to pick it up and read it. They estimated around 1 million jobs would be created if we focused on dealing with climate change in the UK. And then this year, the PCS trade union have updated that, and they talked about energy democracy and the need to reclaim our energy systems and take a public-led approach to dealing with the problem if we want to move forward. But these are all sort of broad brush estimates for the UK. It still seems there's a gap between talking about the amazing, huge things we're going to do and then what's actually happening.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's the real challenge we want to face. Now, just imagine we had a climate summit where instead of this, something was said, well, what if the future's already running away climate change? Shouldn't we also be creating a better world? So even if the world is getting worse, even if the climate disasters are going to hit us head on, even if the droughts and the floods are going to make life more unpredictable, shouldn't we still go for all of these things? And if we did that, maybe our hope would be ahead of the curve. Maybe fear would hide behind hope, rather than hope hiding behind fear. Maybe mitigation could lead adaptation and transform what adaptation looks like. Well, if we were to do that, we really need to set out a plan. Because the plan we're working to at the moment is a plan that relies on economics in some kind of trickle-down way to do the best that it possibly can without us actually individually doing anything much apart from what we're told to do by that system. Somehow, National Grid, the government, the World Economic System, a few economic pricing will make that change. Well, what if we actually committed a plan to be zero carbon, zero waste, we transformed farming and the rural economy, and that localised and transformed our transport systems, and we did that across the UK, and we committed to it, and we made a plan for it, and we said this is what is required, and then we quantified it, and then we set out to do it. We would have a clear alternative to the current non-plan which confronts us. What we think that would mean is linking climate change with planning. God help us. Sometimes we try to link climate change with economics and forget this thing called planning. What have we planned for the UK to create jobs and planned for the UK to deal with climate change together? And it wasn't just left to this profession of economists. Well, we've been working, the Green European Foundation and Greenhouse think tank, to look at what that plan might look like. And how many jobs would that be? Doing what and where? And across which different sectors? It would need to include energy. These slides are sort of jimble-jambled a little bit, but energy is renewable powered, not centralised. Transport would be about sustainable transport. Accessibility equal to a focus on mobility. Localisation, therefore, is key. Co-location between work and where we live. Buildings is a big retrofit challenge, an energy retrofit challenge. We need to make better what we've got already, not make what we've got already bigger and more disposable, which brings us to waste. We need to create a truly circular economy. We were not that brave. We started with a relatively smaller island than the UK. We thought we'd start with the Isle of Wight. The great thing about the Isle of Wight is the transport system is quite easy to define. There are distances you can only go before you go into the sea. And at that point we got to a main challenge, which is there's a distinction between the jobs we need to do, the work we need to do to transition us from where we are now to where we want to be, and then the jobs which, when we get there, will then sustain us and make that built environment better, improve our well-being, and improve the sustainability and resilience of our communities going forward. We then looked at a slightly bigger area, the local enterprise partnership area for the Sheffield City region. Why? Because the government is putting a lot of money into local enterprise partnerships for things like roads, and bypasses, and roads. Well, what if that sort of central, national, directed infrastructure economic planning wasn't being directed towards transport to make our economy developing in a way that connected the big cities to each other faster and better, but connected the rural areas to the countryside?
Have you got the right jobs figures there? I think they're the same as the Isle of Wight.
They are a lot bigger for Sheffield. They're about 10 times the size.
Yes.
Anyway, let's skip over that. Anyway, we focus on enterprise partnership areas, and they're all being given the task to have energy strategies this year. So now we're looking at a plan for the UK, and then we're launching it here and in Bristol next weekend, and then we're presenting it at the climate conference at a fringe event in December. So key features of this, I'll now skip through these next few slides. We want to focus not just on this magical link between our lives and economics, how we live, but also what we build, and how what we build determines to a large extent how we live in those places afterwards. Things last a long time. Houses, roads. When you build a road, it lasts longer than the car you put on it. So unless we change what we build, we won't change how we live. Unless we change what we invest in, we won't change what we build, and it'll be very difficult to do anything but lock ourselves into our current lifestyles. So we need to change that. We need to shift capital investment away from making everything bigger, like third runways, extra roads, to making what we've already got better, more robust, and able to be sustained for longer. And that means our economy will be more circular. So rather than take, make, use, dispose, throw away at an ever bigger scale, we want to make these links between what we've got, which means it isn't a simple different sector challenge. It's about how everything joins up together. And we need to make those joining ups happen at a human scale and more locally. Thirdly, we need to plan for this. So let's start by having a plan. That's a revolutionary way to do planning, isn't it? Once we've got a plan, we need to do a plan that reduces our climate and environmental impact rather than increasing our rate of consumption. That has different starting points. That will change our economic development. It will transition our industry, because the industry is based on the infrastructure which we have. And if we change our infrastructure, if we change our industry, we can change how we live. So the jobs plan we're looking at is partly jobs to make that transition, and then partly jobs that creates that new future. And you will see that they overlap with each other. And we think that plan needs to be democratic. That means it needs to be public sector led. The energy system is a key driver, and how we do that needs to be planned at a national level. Not at a city level, not at local level, we need a national plan. Within that national plan, we can then plan at a much more local level how we do the industry and how we live our lives. So what does that look like? At this point, I'm going to hand over to Peter, because this bit gets complicated.
I'll just pause to let the lady come in. So, Jonathan has sort of why we're doing this, what the starting point is. So what we've done is we've looked at creating a model. So we haven't modelled it on local authorities. We've modelled it on NUTS codes, which is the European hierarchical codes, but they loosely coalesce with local authorities. So we've taken all these NUTS 3 regions across the entire, there's 180 or something across the UK, and we've tried to, using a standardised set of assumptions, model what the transition would look like for each of these sectors. So I'm going to go through the sectors and then come out to present some results. So the new climate jobs. So, and obviously the purpose of this is to try and look at what needs to happen where. Some things are very much determined by population. So, for instance, transport and recycling, and the buildings, where the buildings are determines where they need to be retrofitted and where those jobs are. Other things are more by land area or where it's windy and things like this. So, the offshore renewables will be at the relevant ports for where those resources exist. Wind and solar things are spread throughout the countryside, and also the change in land jobs and food and farming jobs are spread throughout the countryside. So sectors. So we have modelled 5 sectors. The first one of these is energy, and this includes offshore, although we haven't distributed the offshore. That's just a block of jobs. Includes building retrofits, so predominantly dwellings, because that's the data we've got at the moment. Transport, and then reuse and recycling. Reuse and recycling, recycling being the lesser of the two. Land use, although we haven't included these numbers yet. And the total transition estimate is about 700,000 jobs nationally. And then the long-term estimate is just over 600,000. So lots of these different numbers are based on different things, but broadly they're based on they're either national estimates that are scaled down, or they're based on job metrics that come from real examples in the UK. We think they're conservative estimates. We haven't included a lot of the multipliers. For instance, the industrial sector, these are all based on primary changes. So to build this wind turbine, you need this many jobs. We haven't included, say, the jobs to make that wind turbine, or to supply the parts, or provide the lorry or the crane or any of that. That's all supply chain. Those are all things that, you could put multipliers in for, but they'd be much harder to justify. So this is the conservative estimate for the primary jobs. It's all based on proven technologies. These are all things that we could do now. There's no carbon capture and storage of biomass or any of that. All the jobs metrics are based on either infrastructure change or activity change. If we did this, we had another bus that went this many miles, how many jobs would that create? If we built this, how much jobs would it create to build it, and how many jobs could it take to maintain it? So all of the metrics are based on simple physical multipliers of physical things. So, renewable energy. In this sector, we have looked at installing wind, solar and tidal, maintaining these, planning, and then obviously once you've built them, there's then a load of, you have to look at how you're going to store that energy. If you change the electricity network, there's then a load of complexities in terms of how you maintain demand and whether you increase more flexibility demand. So we've started looking at that a little bit as well. And a lot of it comes into demand management, so changing how much energy we use and when we use it, which is then links into the building retrofit and these other sectors. So the additional jobs for the transition, as I've mentioned before, so the key point to note here is at the bottom, we have subtracted the current jobs from power stations. So these aren't just the new jobs, these are the new jobs minus the ones that we know are going to be lost. Another reason why we think these estimates are conservative. And there are some things that we haven't managed to find job metrics for. So, for instance, landfill gas, we haven't got a specific metric for landfill gas at the moment. So there are little bits that will probably be on top of that because we haven't managed to find reliable metrics yet.
Just say what you mean by a metric.
A metric. So a metric is one of these examples of so many full-time equivalents employed per megawatt of wind turbine installed, or per 100 dwellings retrofitted with solar panels.
And we're using published information.
Yes, and we publish. We're using the same set of metrics broadly that are published in the back of the Sheffield report in an annex, and the actual job numbers for Sheffield are also published in the report. So feel free to have a look. So built environment, we have assumed a street-by-street retrofit because to get the pace and scale of change required, you need to do it in scale, in blocks. But it's energy efficiency improvements, renewable energy, solar thermal and ground source heat pumps are the technologies we modelled. For retrofits, as I said, and then I won't read them out, but these are the jobs totals and those are the different technologies. And then we've assumed some maintenance, because if you add more things to people's homes and you want them to use it correctly, you then have to pay people to go, this is how it works, oh it's broken, you need to configure it right, so on and so forth. So those are the additional building retrofit jobs. Better transport. So we have assumed things like more car share, increased public transport, improving the walk and cycling facilities, preventative motor maintenance. There's lots of things we would assume would be part of the transition. Unfortunately, it's impossible to model them all because metrics don't exist. So the ones we actually modelled are these ones here. So we've modelled additional bus journeys, we've modelled additional railway journeys, and because if you transition from majoritively fossil fuel driven cars to majoritively electric vehicles, the technology change, so does the maintenance change. Electric vehicles require a lot less maintenance than fossil fuel cars, so we've included the negative jobs, as it were, from that. Reuse and recycling, again, these are the sort of things that we think the transition would look like. We haven't been able to model all of them, so what we've done is we've modelled recycling. So currently we're at 45% recycling rate, that's average, although we've done it for every NUTS 3 region. We've taken the existing recycling rate and the proposed recycling rate, and then we've mapped what the transition would be. So if your local authority is better or worse than the average now, that affects in the jobs numbers. And although this again makes it conservative, because reuse is always more labour intensive than recycling. The more you can substitute labour for energy, so reuse always uses less energy and it creates more jobs. And then again for land, food and forestry, so a much more localised approach, much so to reduce food miles, but also to have more mixed farming and more active management of woodlands so that we can benefit from the resources that are there, which may be more useful with less fossil fuel energy. So this is a land use map of the entire UK. This comes from the Coltrane data, which provided European-wide. So we've taken that as a starting point. And then we're still working on the exact jobs modelling for that. So we've built a model, but you can talk to me about that if you want in detail. We've also assumed community and volunteer jobs. So if you have all these new jobs that we've created, you can't assume that there's people with the skills to take them on. So we've put in some multipliers, which are included at the bottom here, to go, well, if we want everyone, if we want to utilise all of the available workforce, some people are going to have special access needs, some people are going to need additional support in order to be able to do those jobs, so that creates some more jobs. And also there's going to be a load of training and reskilling to do in order to have people to fill all these jobs, because those people don't exist at the moment. So then this is the total of the jobs, which breaks down those two numbers I gave you earlier on. I've given you a lot of numbers, I apologise. We'll go to images. So this is a population density map, very dense in the urban areas, and then these are less so concentrated. So that's transition job density map, and that's the long term. Slightly different, but similar. And I think at this point I pass back to Jonathan.
Thank you very much. I think I might just leave that slide up there for a second, because I think for me that tells a really important story. We're not talking here about just in every place a few people doing different things. This is about a transition for the UK. If we focus more on renewable energy, if we focus more on the importance of food and farming and energy production, as essential aspects of our economy. If we build a foundation which starts with the land, rather than hanging skyhooks off the City of London and how much money the financial sector can bring us in, we aren't trying to create a sustainable economy and hang it off an unsustainable economy. We're trying to build a sustainable economy from the ground up. And the ground of the UK covers the whole of the UK land area. 40% of the land area isn't in this tiny area called London. So we need to rebalance our economy in the UK, and we need to shift that. And that means that there isn't going to be the continued demand of people to move, and people with skills to move to urban centres, particularly big cities, and particularly London for work. There isn't going to be so much of a split between where skilled, semi-skilled and less skilled jobs are in the UK. This is going to change the nature of the UK economy. So to conclude, I'm suggesting to you this is around a 3 million jobs-led transition for the UK. Why do I say 3 million when Peter's just said 700,000? I am an optimist. Rupert and knows I am an optimist. Why do I say 3 million? Firstly, the 700,000 is 8.4 million man-years of work. This is about how much work it will take us to transition the UK economy to zero carbon with an assumed date of 2030. 8.4 million person-years of work is a lot of work. We can't do that all on Saturday mornings, Tuesday nights in the pub, and as members of political parties. That isn't enough. We actually need to create the jobs so people can do this work. I, in my local green meetings, do not build wind turbines. We're in a mess. Our economy is a long way from being able to operate in a sustainable way. The transition is a large one. The 3 million goes something like this. Firstly, it's 1 million, not 700,000, because our estimates didn't include adaptation at all. This is all about mitigation. We didn't include reforestation. We didn't include retrofits of commercial, public or community buildings. We should retrofit public houses as well as private houses, for example. It didn't include energy storage or distribution. It didn't include the demand reduction, culture change, the arts type jobs which are needed to inspire us to make this transition. Ours is the boring, physical work that needs to be done up and down the country. It's the jobs that are needed to make what we've got better and more spread out, rather than making everything bigger. The 2 million jobs, that's what some people call the just transition. We haven't included that on a number because most of those jobs already exist. It's about changing arms manufacture to arms manufacturer. It's about changing making cars to making wind turbines. It's about using the skills we've already got to manufacturing things which we make and then buy and then throw away, to things which will make our society more sustainable. It's about and doing that in the UK by shortening our supply chains, doing it in a sub-regional way near our cities and towns by shortening them yet further. It's about making our economy more circular. And the third million are the local jobs. So the first million require global planning, global agreements, national planning. The 2 million requires the corporates to play the game created by the new plan we have. And the third million are created locally. The New Economics Foundation used a model called LM3, and they say if you create one job in a local economy and that economy is local, that will generate a further 2. So our 1 million jobs to start with, by doing it in a way that localises our economy, will result in 3 million new jobs. Retail will go back to its origin in French of retailoring. We will do and mend our economy at a local level. Perhaps other towns will have open permanent markets like Norwich does. It'll be locally circular, not just circular. Corner shops and village shops will be in all communities, not being extradited from communities and expelled from them by large supermarkets. And that localisation will make care easier. We'll be able to focus on the wider determinants of health, about what makes us healthy. And a lot of what makes us healthy is about having a job. We need to address unemployment. And that map of the UK, this is about creating jobs where there's unemployment across the UK, rather than driving people to our cities if they want to achieve a higher income or an additional income in their family. So we recognise that to provide opportunities not just for people out of work, unemployed, but also who have mental health issues, there is a need to support people back into work and provide those skills. And what will that look like? Well, just to summarise, I think that means we need to reground our economy on land rather than hang it off the city. Most companies have workers. Our economy needs workers. That's linked to our land, our energy and our resources. Secondly, this will rebalance our economy. We'll move away from capital-centred growth. We'll move away from city-to-city investment in transport infrastructure like HS2. We will instead invest to strengthen our urban-rural links and make UK a UK of the regions, perhaps part of an EU of the regions. And in doing so, create a vision which for the rest of the world doesn't mean trading with us, it means a greater degree of self-reliance and resilience across our planet. And that means we need to relocalise. It means we need to start first with the rural economy and then see the place that the urban economy footprints itself onto that. Sustainable community cities rely on a sustainable countryside. That will increase our resilience. So we can transform and be more adaptive. And if we do this, that means rather than the future being just something we try and protect ourselves from, we can actually create the work so we can also live through it. And I hope that gives us hope. Thank you.
We've now got some time for questions and discussion. I'd like to finish a little bit before 1, so we've got a bit more time for lunch. Yes, about that.
Obviously, take 3 questions first.
This is a huge.
Do you want to stand up so everybody can hear? Sorry.
This is obviously a huge pipe dream, and I was just wondering what you've done and what you're doing or trying to do in order to get this pipe dream in motion.
Yes, go.
Yeah, I mean, my question sort of follows on from that, really, in that I think the vision you've got is fantastic, but, you know, how do you deliver that? And I think what would be really useful in terms of trying to see where you could sort of, you know, start to do it, and it has to be done through incrementalism. I mean, you've got a vision by 2030 of all this happening. I would argue actually you have to sort of focus on particular things and do it incrementally. What would really be useful, along with all those numbers of jobs, what I'd like to see is the carbon footprint of each of those sectors. How are you going to reduce the carbon footprint? And also the inertia you have, the social, economic inertia in making those transitions in those particular sectors. If you put those 3 parameters together, then you focus on the things which have the least inertia, the biggest carbon footprint and the biggest number of jobs, go for that. If you do that, then you've got something which is somehow more quantified and can give policy makers more of a direction to work it out incrementally. But just these numbers of jobs, I'm very, very sceptical of it, like the other questioner, without that other data, so you can focus in and start to roll it out incrementally.
Yeah, I mean, a similar point in a way is how we get to the vision. Now, I want to focus on something that bothers me, and that's photovoltaics. On 2 particular areas there. One, the lifetime of photovoltaics seems to be incredibly short. A lot of the energy that's being harvested from the sun seems to be actually taken up with the making of these things. And you've got to replace them at a quite short period. And the other thing is, as was one of your slides, if we're covering fields in the countryside with photovoltaics, isn't that taking away some of the land we need for sustainable agriculture?
I'm going to, my chair's prerogative to come in on that. A few years ago now, at least one maker of solar PV had an energy payback of a year. And secondly, putting panels on fields, it rules out some forms of agriculture, but not all of it. You could still graze sheep, for example. It's very good. They do better with the solar panels because it gives them some shade, some shelter. So I'll let these two respond now. But brief, so that we've got time for questions.
We have assumed, so about half of our solar jobs are all on dwelling roofs, so they don't take up any land area that's not already taken up. And the other half of ours is, so if you look at some of the, they're a very small percentage of the jobs, by the way, but if you look at some of the assumptions that some of the like Zero Carbon Britain produce in terms of how many gigawatts, I mean, supposedly Zero Carbon Britain is all on roof space. None of it is on fields. But the only we haven't assumed any fields are converted beyond what is already converted to solar farms. That is what's done at the moment because that's what makes sense in the current commercial thing because agriculture is undervalued and that sort of thing. But that's not what we're proposing. In the lifespan thing, yes, but I agree. Compared to other things, it has got a low lifespan, but we haven't had it as a very large part of it, and also it's you have to have a balance of technologies, or the balancing demand and supply becomes almost impossible. Do you want to go back to him now?
I'll have a go. A vision and a pipe dream. Well, if you go back to Richard Douthwaite, he said we need to think away from end of pipe solutions. At the moment, we quite often look upon a problem and pollution, and we deal with it, and it creates another problem, and it becomes really complicated. And what we try to do is strip it right back and say, our fundamental problem is about the level of resources and energy we use, where we live, and how far away we live is from where we work. Now, if we start with those presumptions, maybe it isn't a pipe dream, it's maybe closer to reality. The 2030 question. We've picked 2030 because the 2030 is where the Green Party we should have the deadline is. It's where Kevin Anderson of the Tyndall Centre says, that's where we should be getting to zero by, in the UK, if not globally, by the 2035, 2040 timescale. And if we're going to provide leadership and others are going to follow, this infrastructure investment plan is challenging. We need to change the way the economy is directed around. So the problem is we're not the only people who have pipe dreams and visions. The Global Commission on the Economy and Climate published a report about a month ago. They say that we need globally we're planning to spend £70 trillion on infrastructure by 2030, which will increase the amount of infrastructure by more than the total that already exists everywhere on the planet today. I don't see our pipe dream any more ambitious than the pipe dreams of the mainstream economists and governments. The only difference is their pipe dream will definitely lead us to have runaway climate change. Our pipe dream has the possibility that we might avoid it. So I would urge you to back it. And the other thing is, I think both of the first two questions suggest it as our plan. I think it should be our plan. We need to share this as a green movement. This needs to be mainstream culture in what we think sensible looks like. We need to create a new normal, and we need to own it. And I don't agree that we need to do lots more analysis to prove it. I mean, I kind of, this is a bit of a ramble, so I'll keep it short. Why did the hedgehog cross the road to get the other side, to join his flatmate? Why did the lemming cross the road? Well, one went and then all the others followed and they went over a cliff. What happened? Where do we go from here? Why did the rabbit cross the road? Well, the rabbit got halfway and then stood and saw a light at the end in the distance and kept looking. I think that's a big light. I think maybe it's a lorry. Can I read the registration plate? I think I need more information. No, I think sometimes with climate change, we're trying to gather enough information to perfectly understand the problem before we permit ourselves to start acting to deal with it. And I think the challenge for climate change is the same as the economists. The economists who say that we need to spend 70 trillion by 2030, they haven't calculated it in infinite detail, but they're prepared to publish it and promote it at international conferences. Why aren't we, who are proposing an alternative, having the same gall to actually say we believe that this is realistic and deliverable at the scale required, and that we can try to envision a way of delivering it? And I think we need to have the confidence as a movement that if the economists can bullshit their ways around the world based on stuff that's going to trash the planet, this isn't bullshit, but some of the estimates are rough. But what we need to do is give an indication of the scale of the challenge, and that's what we're trying to do here. These numbers might go up or down by 10 or 20%, but we think they're in the right order of magnitude, and we want to give you an idea of the scale of the challenge, and I think that should give us the confidence to sit alongside economists and business leaders and governments and say, look, we're sensible. Let us join your table, let us join your discussion, and let us have a different future as a result.
Can I just pick up a very quick point to do with the information. So we've modelled 180 different areas, and each one has, 30, 40 jobs estimates, and then we've got all the infrastructure changes that go behind them. How are we going to present that in a 20-minute conversation? The answer is we're not going to give you all the information. If you want to look at it in a sensible way you can actually interpret it, look at your area. If we give you just the line for your area, that's something manageable. It has some jobs, but it also has what you actually need to build and some other things that maybe we haven't got jobs for. So the information is there, we just haven't given it all. Because,
well, it will be.
Yeah.
When we publish it. When we get around to publishing it.
Yeah.
I'm going to let... do I need to move that little microphone over to here? That's all right, yeah. At the back, John. And so he's got a few things that he wants to share with us, and then I'll have a couple of other contributions.
Can I sit down still?
Yes, that's fine, but I think you need to try and speak up.
Yes, okay. 2030, 2050, so far as we are concerned, as much as we can now. Okay. Two questions which arose from what I saw on the screen. How many of us in this room are generating our own electricity from solar panels on our roofs? I'm putting half a hand up because we've just moved from a house with solar panels into a small flat, and I'm yet to get the whoever they are, our landlords, to work on this one. Okay? The second question is how many of us are growing our own food?
Not all of it.
I didn't say all of it. I didn't say all of it.
All of it.
Okay, all right. We moved into a 2-bedroom flat on the first floor. We've been eating beans, tomatoes and potatoes grown on our small veranda. We have also been making compost, first of all in my bedroom, now out on the veranda. I had a lot of opposition in that order. It's what we do. Okay. I have another figure. You were arguing about, is it 1 million or 3 million jobs? Okay. I think we're talking about 60 million jobs. Is that about the population of this country?
We don't have enough jobs there.
And I think that applies to all of us. And it applies from the day of birth until the day of death. Why from the day of birth? What happens to the big jobs of a baby? Okay, does it go into a plastic nappy? Or does it go into a nappy made of a hole which used to be a towel? Sorry, a towel which has got too big a hole in it to be used. Or from our clothes which have got so many holes in them that they can't be worn anymore. So right from the word go, all of us can be involved in this thing about jobs. I've got a problem with the word jobs, and this is what the first question was going to be. Okay, the first comment was going to be. My problem with the word jobs is that jobs often increase the problem rather than decrease the problem, especially if those jobs are jobs of profit-making employers, or jobs with profit-making employers. And that has been the whole trend in recent years, to get more and more of our jobs done through the private sector. Okay? Because what I would like to see are not-for-profit employers. Very different from profit-making employers. Profit-making employers say, yes, we're providing jobs, but yet they are working hand over fist to mechanise jobs as much as they can to get more profit, to import cheap labour or use cheap labour wherever it might be, blah, blah, blah. So I much prefer the word livelihoods. And I think those of us in East Anglia who come from farming backgrounds will understand more what a livelihood is than a job. If you're running a local farm or involved in local farming, not from the first big job of the baby, but from certainly the children are involved in that work and contributing to the livelihood of that farm from an early age. I think I've said enough.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Simon, and then the guy back there.
Yeah, my question is, I think a couple of days ago, Jeremy Corbyn said that he was going to create 400,000, I think it was, green jobs. Do you think that's a hollow promise?
Can I answer that in a minute after Bob?
Thanks. I'm one of those dreadful people. I'm an economist. I'm a macroeconomist. I'm also a labour economist with a small L and a large L. So, as you can imagine, I come at this from a slightly different perspective. But I mean, I totally agree with everything you said. But I think the one thing which is always left out of all these green discussions for the last 35 years that I've been attending, and it's not a criticism of the Green Party, it's as much a criticism of everybody, which is that 30 years ago we completely abandoned the idea of local and regional planning within the UK in terms of our economies. It was, people just decided one day that they didn't work, there were a few failed examples, and therefore we're never going to try local and regional planning again. And what you're talking about so much is the need for some top-down planning to start off with, because quite clearly, if you're going to invest in so much of these fantastic jobs, then you're going to have to start switching resources from one place to another. And those resources are not naturally going to go into those jobs unless there's a reason for it to do so, and we need to plan it. And I'll just give you one example, which I'm sure most people haven't noticed, but I think it's fundamental to Norfolk and it's fundamental to Britain. How many people saw last week that the Office of National Statistics have suddenly revised down the number of new houses that we need in Britain from 225,000 a year to 150,000 a year? Now that's the most dramatic change. It's one of the biggest mistakes that anyone's ever made. But the problem is that in terms of structure plans, most structure plans are set for 20 years advance. So we now have completely unsustainable and unnecessary housing targets set for Britain, and yet it's going to take us 20 years to put them right at the moment, because believe it or not, there is no mechanism in British law for structure plans to have their numbers taken down, and therefore we're going to be building a ridiculous number of houses. And that's just one example of no local and national planning integrated. The other thing I would just mention, and this will be something which I'm sure we can all agree, most carbon emissions now in Britain come from what is loosely described as transport. Now, the fundamental thing we need to do in Britain is to have an integrated transport policy based on public transport. If we've learned anything in Britain, surely, it's the fact that the car and roads are a disaster for the environment. All new buildings, all current buildings, should have an integrated transport policy, which means something, and we should price cars completely off the road if we're serious about trying to tackle climate change. Thanks.
Thank you. Just if you want to know about the Green, I was one of the authors of a greenhouse report on tackling our housing crisis. If you use date, you can buy it out there. So we were arguing that actually we don't need the number of, well, this problem's not going to be solved by building more houses. It's all to do with the money, really, and where the money goes. So I'm going to take one more contribution and then I'll let these two come in. Tommy.
Yeah, just I'm from Dublin, and Jonathan and Peter were in Dublin at a conference. They were on the same theme recently in June, where we brought in the trade union movement, because it was quite inspiring, I have to say. I'm an optimist. I'm also a founder member of the Irish Green Party, And as you get older, you want to see a bit more concrete results rather than theory. And we've lots of theories floating about, and there's libraries full of books on what we should do, and but there's not enough happening on the ground. And that's what we were looking at. And so that's why I welcome this whole trend towards putting figures on it. I mean, it was in 1968 that Robert Kennedy spoke about GDP and GNP are the wrong measure. And Greens have been talking about that for years. And yet, they still use it every day. Economists are using it every day. So therefore, we've got to look at it, come at it in this way. And our conference number, we took a particular example of the Midlands of Ireland, which has power stations using peat as the fuel. It's been there since the 1940s. It created thousands of jobs. There are towns and villages in the Midlands of Ireland, and we all know about the emigration from Ireland, that are sustained by this peat harvesting and the power stations and the electricity it creates. And they are due to close in 2030, according to the government. Greens and everyone wants them closed earlier. They want them closed actually in 2020, but it'll probably fall somewhere in the middle. But there are going to be 2,500 jobs that will vanish. And what we were addressing there, and Jonathan and Peter put some figures on it, was the where the displacement, where those alternative jobs can be. Because the Greens have always been talking about, there'll be lots of jobs in retrofitting, wind, power, solar, whatever. But they very rarely put figures on it. And this is where this is so necessary. The figures that can be shown, you can show then that the displaced workers will get jobs in the towns and villages doing everything. Now, the trade unions have a particular narrow view of this, where they wanted, like they say, why can't we get an American factory and foreign direct investment just like Dublin? So that's unrealistic. So the type of sustainable towns and villages, and showing that rural life can actually be more sustainable than a city. And there's been lots of written on that too, about the New Economics Foundation and others. So I welcome this, and I think it's long overdue that Greens and others begin to address it in numbers and concrete figures on where the jobs will be, and also the displacement, the net jobs, and also the as they're talking about in Sweden now, if automation and robotics comes about, you're talking about they're talking about a 3 or 4 day week for normal work. This is the industrial system, and I agree with the gentleman that spoke earlier that we need a redefinition of work. Absolutely, but that the way economists and talk about radio, television every day is not the language we would like. But so I welcome this.
Thank you, Tommy.
I'd like to finish at 10:02 actually, to give us a bit more time.
I'll give you a quick response to 2 of the points, and then I'll leave Jonathan to come back to the economist at the back. Simon, your point to do with Labour's proposed 400,000 jobs. Well, it depends very much on what their definition of green is, because they've probably gone, what's in this green category? Those are a few things in this green category. We'll do some of that. It produces some jobs, yeah. But unless you actually go, hang on, some of those, unless you look at where we actually need to get to, if you only look at the short term and you go, well, this is the right direction, we'll do something in that direction, then you can be building in infrastructure that becomes redundant. For instance, gas boilers are more efficient than, new gas boilers are more efficient than old gas boilers. So what do we put new gas boilers in all houses? Well, hang on, by 2030 we've got to have no gas boilers in any houses, and we've been installing them in houses for the last 20 years, even though they're going to be redundant before the end of their lifespan. Unless you work out where we need to get to, and then go, well, hang on, if we need to get to having no fossil fuel cars by 2030, then I don't care how many hybrids we're building, unless it's pointless. We're building cars that are going to be obsolete before the end of their lifetime. So hopefully that responds to your point about Labour's proposal. The other point was to do with livelihoods, and it was mentioned earlier. Why is everything focused on us? What we can do? Well, actually, for people to be able to make a livelihood out of a lot of these things that could be livelihoods, requires systemic change. It requires the system, the way we do things, and the infrastructure to change such that becomes a viable livelihood. Lots of the things that we need to be doing, and are really good examples of what should happen, are currently very, very marginal about whether people can afford to make livelihoods out of them, because the system incentivises against them. We currently subsidise fossil fuels, but we don't subsidise the things we want to do. So surprise, surprise, people have to stop doing the things we want them to do and do the things that are bad for the environment. Until we get the systemic, the economic push-pull factors, the subsidies, the taxes, the planning, the infrastructure, time views in place, people can't make their transition. I'll let Jonathan pick up on the other planning point.
On livelihoods, there is a furniture use charity I'm involved with in Redhill. We have 8 full-time equivalent worth of livelihoods. Unfortunately, only 4 of them are paid. The other 4 are voluntary. But that's still 8 livelihoods which are tied up in that furniture reuse charity. So the problem is, unless we actually create jobs, not everyone can afford to do all of these extra jobs in their spare time. 700,000 jobs worth of effort every year is quite a lot of an ask for people to do in their spare time. So we think that that should be valued as jobs. We haven't in our plan in any way said that they should be public sector or private sector or voluntary sector. We've just said that this is a level of effort that's needed. In terms of planning, I totally agree. In terms of transport planning, I think that they predict and provide, I think, is the way. We predict and provide ever more roads, ever more runways, and ever more houses in the place where our economy is strongest, which means we need to combat that. And our planning system has gone in the last few years from being plan-led to what's called sustainable development-led, although the government only defines sustainable as that which doesn't do open-cast coal mining, so that leaves the fairly big hole in that word in terms of the government's definition. So I agree we should have a national plan, and that's important, and we think there should be a national plan in the Greens for where the jobs should go as well as where the economic development go. And therefore, rather than saying we need to build 200,000 extra houses in this area, you could say we need to build 200,000 extra, to use John's phrase, livelihoods in these places. And our plan is very much about that. It's redirecting the livelihood creation away from the centres of economic growth in ways that create locally sustainable economies. In terms of your car point, I totally agree. I think we need to move from a car-full and a carefree society to a car-free and careful society.
Thank you. I'm going to, John, who's given us some support for this, financially for this whole project, would like to say a few things before we stop for lunch.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Can you hold that?
That's fine.
Otherwise, I'm getting a bit of a state. First of all, a very warm welcome to a fellow Dubliner. Okay. I was born in Dublin, but left when I was 3 years old to come to England. I can't remember what kind of nappy I might have been wearing at the time. Okay, right. This is what I want to say. First of all, congratulations to the Greenhouse think tank. I think you've done a fantastic job, not least the mic holder, in organising this conference. These things are not easy to organise, and you've done it brilliantly. So that's the first thing. And may it be the first of many, because I think we need to do a lot of thinking and a lot of action about fossil fuels. I would like to give 2 quotes which I have picked up from The Guardian during the last few weeks. The first one was from the Secretary General of the United Nations, whose name is Guattari. I don't know if I've got the pronunciation right. And he said, we have to ditch fossil fuels. And he said, we also have to ditch our dependence on fossil fuels by the year 2020. Wow. Okay.
That's a lot of work.
A minute or 2 for that to settle in may not be a bad thing. Okay, right. What I've written down here is what a hell of a challenge for us. But I think we're beginning to respond in some ways to that challenge this morning, very much so. Okay. The other reference from The Guardian would be by George Monbiot. How many people read George Monbiot in The Guardian? great, because that's where a lot of our ideas are be developed. And I almost jumped for joy when I saw his piece on, I think it was Tuesday of this week. If you haven't seen it, I think you can go online somehow or other and see it. What George was saying, he was at last making the connection between fossil fuels and economic growth, okay? Which takes me to some work we have been banging on about over the past 2 or 3 years within the Green Party. Initially, this was a document printed on Green Party because it was being circulated within the Green Party. It's now on a, I don't know, whatever colour that is, because it's not just for the Green Party, it's for all of us, it's for all political parties, and for all 60 million of us, okay? And it's called Post-Growth for a Fossil Fuel-Free Future. And George Monbiot, as well as putting those two things together, which are together in that title, is saying that we need to talk about fossil fuels. So, how many times have we heard the word fossil fuels this morning?
In different ways.
Well, you've heard it now. But that's very interesting, and this is the very problem that George Monbiot is saying. Although fossil fuels are the biggest single element in global warming, or human-caused global warming, they're consciously and subconsciously, we have ways of not talking about it. And we, in that respect, we join the climate change deniers. Because whether we know it or not, we are denying the importance of fossil fuels. Why? Because of the implications are huge. Okay. They are mouth-watering. I've got 2 freebies. I've still got 1 or 2 copies of this for anyone who hasn't seen it. Okay, to give out during the lunch period. I've also got some copies of a yellow document which was produced for fellow shareholders in Royal Dutch Shell. I believe in divesting from big oil, but I believe in divest and engage. And because I own shares in Shell, and I got them as a result of Mrs. Thatcher selling off the public utilities in the 1980s, and I bought those shares because I felt I still needed to have some kind of control of what was being done. And if they were being taken away from my representatives in Parliament, blah, 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 blah. Okay. During the past year, I have entered into a fairly detailed dialogue with Royal Dutch Shell and have submitted a total of 4 separate scenarios on their future. If you go online, you can look at a number of the scenarios which the Shell Scenarios Department have actually published online. Not one of those scenarios is a scenario about reducing the production of fossil fuels. How can they not do that? Well, George Monbiot is saying there is a conscious and unconscious refusal to get to grips with fossil fuels. Okay, right. And as a result, towards the end of making those 4 submissions, I produced a 2-page submission for my fellow shareholders and distributed it at the last Shell shareholders meeting in London. Okay. And this whole thing started a year before that when I asked a question at the Shell shareholders meeting in London. Okay. If there are people here who are also have shares in Shell, either directly or indirectly, a fair chunk of my pension comes from investments in Shell, and a fair chunk of my salary at one stage, and a number of stages in my career, came from Royal Dutch Shell. I've got copies of that summary of the work I've been doing there. Right, now my 5 minutes is nearly up. Listen, what were the other 2 things I wanted to say? Okay. Yes, this is the last thing, and this is finally a challenge to Greenhouse think tank. One of the things Guattari said in The Guardian was that there has been a dearth of leadership on the question of fossil fuels, and indeed on the leadership for climate change. And Rupert, was giving examples of that in his first speech. Okay, but my challenge for the Greenhouse think tank now is to take up the challenge of ditching fossil fuels as the primary concern in our continuing work within the Greenhouse think tank. We need a lot more thinking about climate change and fossil fuels. Getting rid of fossil fuels is extremely hard. One of the quotations I got back from my dialogue with Royal Dutch Shell is it's an eye-watering challenge. Okay, I like that phrase. Right, thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
That's my
We're going to break